What you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin and John Kropsic. And John, one of the really nice things about doing this podcast is that we develop some pretty incredible relationships. And we've got incredible guests from major think tanks, liberal, conservative, moderate. We get a lot from publishers that we deal with all the time. From universities, university presses. It's really nice. It really is.
It is. Plus, we for me, I find you get some different ideas and a different way to approach things that I didn't think about before. So even for me, I'm learning.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought you had everything crammed right in that cranium. No. There was nothing left. No random access memory left on that old device. Well, no, I will tell you that Darrell West was with us before, and you remember that podcast, The Future of Work.
Yes.
How many times have we tried to warn people what the future of work is going to look like? And it just gets exhausting because it's really hard to figure out. But having said that, Darrell West from the Brookings Institution, one of those fine think tanks, has written another book. And he's a guy who comes from the Midwest, ends up in a lot of the more academic elite parts of the East, and finds himself somewhat askew from his own background. And so I think there are a lot of people who find that. And they look at their lives and they say, I love my family, and I know they're good people and they're hardworking and everything, but my views have changed. And so he can talk about it from a firsthand standpoint. So he wrote this book called Divided Politics, Divided Nation, Hyper-Conflict in the Trump Era. And he writes it as an ode, to what it is that he loves about his background and his upbringing, wondering what can we do to try to bring us together? Can't we all just get along, John?
I find myself
Rodney King.
I find myself constantly wondering what I'm missing when people come out with these policies sometimes, and I scratch my head because I think we can all agree on that something must be done with the budget and a lot of stuff, but then nobody does anything. It boggles my brain. So I understand where this guy's coming from. Because I'm constantly questioning my thinking.
Well, he can see it from both sides because he's lived in a certain area that felt disenfranchised, many of whom voted for Donald Trump, and yet he doesn't quite understand, the phenomenon because he doesn't internalize it, but he does understand it, objectifies it, understands his family, loves them, understands where there are these tensions in our society, and he tries to explain what it is that's going on in the minds of people who feel as disenfranchised as many people in America feel, even if he's one of the people that they say they're disenfranchised against. So he kind of lives in that bubble of Washington, D.C., but he can see it from a larger perspective.
I think, though, the media, too, I think we kind of expect too much of these people running for office and these people who get in office like they're supposed to be some type of super beings. And, they don't have all the answers. Donald Trump didn't. I don't think that any of them have all the answers. And I don't know. I think sometimes our perception is wrong about how we look at these people to start with.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the pressures that are on them, I'm not talking about in the think tanks, but those who are policymakers, when they get to Washington, there's a lot of interference that goes on from lots of places. And in fact, I find it very interesting that Ted Cruz and AOC are now perhaps getting together to say, hey, look, if you've been in Congress, Don't come back here as a lobbyist. We're going to block you from doing that because there's so much of a revolving door. There's so much about our politics that ultimately does have to change. And when you see at least a conservative and a liberal getting together on something, you got to be grateful. But, Darrell West, his paternal grandfather was a member of the KKK. And here's a guy who ends up teaching at Brown University in Rhode Island, a very liberal institution. And he looks at, these things and says, I've seen it from all sides now, and I can understand what's going on in our society. And that's why I think he's a very good person to write a book like this at this moment in time to help put it in perspective for us. And that's what he does, and he helps us through it today on our podcast. So we want to welcome him back, and we want to tell you that this week we really have something of a mini-series, John. People who left a certain part of America that doesn't feel like another part of America, and yet they are here to interpret for us what's going on in both of those different Americas, if you will. So we start with Darrell West today, and then later, the next podcast that we will be posting is with Deborah Gwartney, and she's written a very interesting book called I Am a Stranger Here Myself. So again, the issues of identity and politics and partisanship today in America on America Trends. With us on the line is Darrell West from the Brookings Institution. He's written a new book called Divided Politics, Divided Nation, Hyper-Conflict in the Trump Era. And you make this a very personal memoir about the divisions that we have in America, but you bring them right down to the level of your own family.
Larry, it's nice to be with you, and you're exactly right. The book is a family memoir about political polarization in America. So I was raised on a dairy farm in rural Ohio. It's a very conservative area, but then I taught political science for 26 years at Brown University, which is a very liberal institution. And then my immediate family is a microcosm of some of the differences that we see in America, in the sense that my two sisters are Christians who are very supportive of President Trump. My brother and I are more liberal and not big fans of the president. So family reunions always are very interesting.
Yeah, what do you think it's doing, honestly, to the family structure? Because I know that there are many times where you might think about striking up a political conversation, and then you're looking across at a family member and you think the better of it because you really don't want to get into what has become more heated than really illuminating today.
I think that is the case. And since I've written the book, I've been hearing from a lot of people about political differences within their own families. And I know a couple weeks ago, Arthur Brooks was on Morning Joe, and he talked about a statistic I'd not heard before. He said 1 in 6 Americans now say they have stopped talking to a family member because of political differences. So I think this is becoming more common. I think President Trump has polarized the nation, and that he's divided families. We see it with George and Kelly and Conway. It's a very prominent example of a liberal husband and a conservative wife who works for President Trump. So this is an issue many families are having to deal with.
Well, ironically, it seems as if George Conway himself is a conservative, but there are the never Trump conservatives. I read a brilliant column yesterday by George Will about the 2020 election. And of course, he said one thing that Mr. Mueller could never do is provide cover as acceptable the other behaviors of Donald Trump. And there's George Will, a devout traditional conservative.
Yeah, that's exactly right. There are interesting differences within both parties in the sense that there are conservative Republicans who don't like Donald Trump and don't like the direction in which he has moved the Republican Party. And then on the Democratic side, we've seen divisions between the centrist and moderate Democrats versus the progressive wing that has gained power in recent years. And, we will see that play out in the 2020 presidential election. So there are interesting differences between the parties as well as within each of the parties.
Absolutely. There is an analysis that might suggest, for example, with the Democrats, that they need to find a candidate in this gaggle of candidates who can get to the base, and keep the base happy, mollified, without moving too far to the left, while trying to engage those Reagan Democrats who obviously now are Trump Republicans.
Absolutely, and that is going to be a very delicate balancing act for many of the Democratic presidential candidates, because the center of gravity within the party clearly has shifted to the left in recent years, in part as a reaction to Donald Trump, but also just the growing strength of the progressive wing of that party. But yet at the same time, we know that some of the crucial battleground states are those Midwestern states where candidate Trump did very well. So my home state of Ohio, Pennsylvania, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And so the candidate, the Democratic Party is going to need a candidate who can both gain support from progressives, but still carry some of those more traditional Midwestern states.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough act. By the way, you don't do this from any remove. This book, Divided Politics, Divided Nation, we'll talk more about your family and some of the surprises you found when you did your research. But you also had a close encounter with Donald J. Trump that you tell us about.
I did. This happened in 2012. I'd actually made a critical comment about him in Politico, the D.C.-based news source. And I didn't think too much about it, but the morning that quote about him appeared, I get a call from Trump's executive assistant asking for my email address, and shortly thereafter, I got a message in which he had pasted my comment about him in the text of that message, and then he wrote in big black bold letters, "Darrell, you are a fool. Best wishes, Donald J. Trump." So I was really shocked that a billionaire cared what a think tank person said about him.
And then Michael Cohen.
2 years later, in 2014, I wrote a book entitled Billionaires, about the growing impact of the wealthy in American politics. And as part of the promotion of that, we developed a billionaire political power index. And Trump was rated 18th on that list. And so one day I'm sitting in my office, the phone rings, I look at it, the caller ID says Trump.org, and I'm thinking, no, it can't be. Now, it was not Donald Trump himself, but it was a guy who identified himself as an attorney for Donald Trump. I didn't really know very much about the guy, but he introduced himself as Michael Cohen, of course, who we now know as Trump's fixer. And so he wanted to know why Trump was rated so low when he clearly should be near the top of that list. We had a 20-minute conversation about the methodology, how we had reached our conclusions, and then, of course, he wanted me to move Trump up the list, which we did not do. But it was certainly interesting to get that call.
So you got the full Trump treatment years before the rest of us. How did you end up teaching? When you ended up teaching at Brown, and there you say the divide was between Democrats and socialists. How did your family, I mean, this is before Trump, I mean, how did your family react to the fact that, oh boy, he's gone over to the dark side, because your family was, well, conservative, many in your family?
Yeah, my conservative was certainly, my family was certainly very conservative when I was growing up, and my two sisters stayed in the rural community and stayed very conservative in their views, and then somehow I ended up teaching at this very liberal institution. So for me, it was actually interesting to go back and forth between those worlds, because as someone who did a lot of political analysis at that time, it was important to actually understand both the red states and the blue states. And so I would often talk with my sisters about, you know, why they like Ronald Reagan, then why they like George W. Bush, and now why they like Donald Trump. And so I think it helps inform my analysis. And then, of course, now the progressives are gaining power in American politics. The fact that I taught so many years among the liberal tribe at Brown University helped prepare me for progressives in terms of how they think about the issues, what they're worried about, and what they might end up doing once they gain more power.
Now, I know you were surprised, a lot of people doing genealogical work on their family, to find out that your paternal grandfather was a member of the KKK. What kind of revelation was that for you?
Well, that was a complete shock. My sister actually discovered that about 10 years ago. She was working on a family history, and she had asked the living members of my father's generation just to write a few short memories that she would include in her volume. And one of my aunts, among other memories, said, and Dad, my grandfather, used to host secret meetings of the Ku Klux Klan at one of the family farms. And that was the first time we had heard about that. There'd been no discussion of that when we were growing up. Now, the aunt was a little older, so I talked with my sister about this, and we agreed we should talk with one of the younger aunts just to see if that indeed was the case. My sister did that, and the second aunt confirmed, yes, this was a dark and embarrassing secret, which is the reason nobody had wanted to talk about it, but it actually was true. So, it certainly is shocking to learn that about your own family, but so I talk about that in the book.
Let's talk about the genesis of where we are today with this incredible divide that is political, it's become personal, emotional, and you say that you went to this think tank in the middle of a political swamp. So let's assume certain people are in their left-wing swamps, others in their right-wing swamps, and you say you're in a political swamp in D.C. I mean, how different is it when you are in Washington, D.C.? Because a lot of people think that this little postage stamp of a place is a pretty unique place unto itself and very different in terms of the way it operates. So you've seen it all from right to left to the political swamp. What does it look like from there?
It is actually interesting, especially at this moment in time, being in Washington, D.C., and just seeing the polarization and the dysfunction up close. And sometimes it's very disturbing to see that. Meeting people, we regularly host business leaders, politicians, and university experts at Brookings. So you meet a lot of prominent individuals, and it's always interesting to kind of, hear their perspectives, see how they think, how they operate on their feet. But it kind of adds another dimension to having grown up in a very conservative area and then also teaching at a liberal university.
But you and they are the anti-Christ, if you will, to many in the Trump coalition. They look at eggheads or academics or intellectuals or experts and say, you've gotten it wrong for a long period of time. Why should we listen to you? And therefore, fact and all that study, all that research, to them is a lot of hogwash. I mean, how do you react to that?
I mean, Donald Trump ran against coastal elites and policy experts of exactly the sort that I work with every day at the Brookings Institution. So, we do research on major policy issues, and some of my colleagues did help devise some of the policies that Trump himself was criticizing. And so it's interesting to see his critique of what we do. We try and learn from those criticisms. We try and emphasize facts in our research, so it's not just opinions we're spouting, but we try and find facts that back up claims that we make. But it is an era where people are suspicious of the experts, and of course, we have to say, the experts oftentimes get it wrong. Every expert was wrong about the outcome of the 2016 presidential election. Some of the policies that get recommended, with the benefit of hindsight, you can see that maybe they weren't the right things at a particular point in time. So it is an era where I think all of us have to re-examine what we're doing and try and do the best job that we can.
Now, even though your politics are more to the left, when you look back at the fact that you grew up and your father was a dairy farmer and he was not a fan of inspectors and regulators, he thought that he knew how to run his family farm. Of course, the fact that many family farms were sold out to agribusiness and so forth, and trying to get back to the family farmer may be a very, very long road. But you had to bring that and that perspective with you to wherever you were. So every time you heard somebody saying, let's add more regulation or whatever, did you go back and hear your father's voice in your head?
I often do hear his voice, and he was a small business person who ran this dairy farm and had, regular problems with inspectors who would come out and inspect his facilities, and worried about excessive regulation and how difficult it was to run a small business. And I think those experiences inform how I think about things. I've tried to take some of the best of both red and blue states in terms of how I think about the issues and what I think the country needs to do. I think coming from a rural background, and I go back there once a year. My two sisters still live there, so I see them regularly, and just seeing how rural areas, and I'm sure this is true all across America, have just been absolutely devastated over the last 3 to 4 decades. Agriculture has declined. Manufacturing jobs have been exported first to Mexico and then now to Europe. Many of my high school classmates stayed in that area. I've seen some of the economic struggles that they have experienced during this time. I stayed in contact with several of my high school friends, and sometimes in the 1980s, the 1990s, and then even into the 2000s, I get either letters or emails from my friends saying, "Oh, I just got laid off again," and some of these people were getting laid off 4 or 5 or 6 times. I had another friend who worked for an agribusiness, and he would write me and say, "Well, we just got taken over again." It was the same company, but through mergers and acquisitions, I think they went through 5 or 6 different owners. So you could see at a very personal level the structural changes that were taking place in America and how they were hitting, especially some of the Midwestern areas, very hard.
And yet you also say that farmers will stay back in Ohio and where your dad and you worked on the farm as a young person, that the GOP actually is a lot closer to these farmers on social and cultural issues, and yet on economic issues, are they really voting their pocketbook in many cases?
I mean, neither party has really done much for family farmers over the last few decades. But most farmers and most of the people with whom I grew up who stayed in that area are still Republican. They still vote for Republican candidates. Most of them voted for Trump. I think I looked up the voting statistics from 2016, and in my home county in rural Ohio, 72% of the people voted for Donald Trump, which I was not surprised at all. And it really is cultural values. They like the fact that Trump is putting conservative jurists on the Supreme Court. Many of the people I know are pro-life in their views, so they want justices that will reflect that point of view. So even though it's not clear Republicans are doing much to help them economically, Republicans are pushing the social and cultural values that many of those people hold.
This is Darrell West, and of course he works at the Brookings Institution, but he's written a new book called Divided Politics, Divided Nation, Hyper-Conflict in the Trump Era. And so when you hear what's on their minds, people who are more conservative than you living in the Midwest, and you know that they are concerned, and he has really been an effective communicator as it relates to bad trade deals, as it relates to some of the values that they hold dear and ascribe to. Do you bring that back to a Brookings where most people aren't terribly sympathetic with those thoughts and say, but folks, we have to understand, and you bring their perspective? How are you trying to bridge the gap? Because the book clearly lays out what the gap is, but how do we bridge it?
Well, certainly I have many colleagues who, when I talk with them, they say, wow, I don't know anybody who voted for Trump. And I tell them I know hundreds of people who voted for Trump. Most of my family, most of my high school friends, and other people that I've encountered over time. And I think talking with conservatives and talking with Trump voters helps me understand what's going on in American politics. I once asked one of my sisters what she liked about Trump, and she told me that she likes the fact that he thinks outside the box. And by that, what she meant was he's somebody who challenges the conventional wisdom. He rejects the status quo because he knows that there are many people being left behind and not being well served by some of the past policies. And so kind of understanding why people voted for him, and kind of the economic discontent that is out there, I think helps me understand American politics and kind of think about what are the policy measures that might make a difference and might help bring the country back together.
Well, the policy measures that he talked about, and they were thin, to say the least. They were mostly slogans. They were mostly diatribes and grievances. I mean, do you think that he's put anything into effect to date that really does talk to the concerns that people had? I don't know if the wall is one of those imaginings that, there's hordes of people coming across taking our jobs, or whether, the fight with China is really on people's minds and they think that's going to lead to things. I know in the short term, many farmers have not been happy with the impact on their crops, like soybeans, when we've had these back and forths with other countries. So tell us what you think. I mean, are there any policy initiatives that back up the populism?
I haven't seen a lot of initiatives that back up some of the things that he talked about in the 2016 election. I mean, he talked about people being left behind, and he was absolutely right about that. He talked about how the system is rigged against the average person. I think he's right about that as well. But I haven't seen him really back up those types of things with policies that are actually going to make a difference. I mean, when you look at his tax policies, he provided tax cuts for middle-class people, but they were temporary tax cuts and of rather modest size, so it's not clear it would actually make a huge difference for people. On draining the swamp, he hasn't really made a lot of progress there. People worry that he's actually added to the swamp as opposed to draining it, so it's a challenge to see how he actually has addressed some of those issues, and I think that will be an interesting part of the 2020 election. I'm sure Democrats will complain that even though he identified some legitimate issues, that he has not actually addressed them or improved the situation.
In your book, you talk about the tribes that we now have all camped into, some that look at more the identity aspect in terms of your gender, your race and such, and many of those on the Democratic side. Then we've got other political tribes. Amy Chua, you reference, and we've had her on our radio program, The Tiger Mom, about different views of conservative and liberal. You also talk about, the conservatives themselves, school prayer, abortion, same-sex marriage, religion. Is it a matter of which of the tribes feels the most aggrieved as to where the swinging pendulum goes in American politics? Because we have been flailing away, and you pointed out in your book, since Ronald Reagan, back and forth, a liberal comes in, and then we dispense with that and we bring in a more, conservative president, and then we say, well, that didn't quite work the way we thought. Let's bring back another liberal, and then a conservative. I mean, we're all over the map, and not much is getting done in the process.
It does seem like over the last 40 years, the pendulum just keeps swinging back and forth, but it's swinging wider and wider. When you look at going from Reagan and George Herbert Walker Bush to Clinton, then to George W. Bush, then to Obama, and now to Trump, it's like there seems to be growing extremes with each election. And much of the general public is still in the middle. The public is still more centrist in its orientations, but the political choices that they're being offered are becoming quite polarized, and essentially they're being given, either very conservative choices or very liberal choices, and not so much in the middle. And of course, that actually makes polarization worse because people end up not liking the choices, feel that they have to choose between individuals that don't really speak to their concerns, and then when the government is polarized and not able to address issues in a meaningful way, that makes people even more cynical and upset with government.
So does that give someone like Howard Schultz a real option here to run up the middle? Because in a two-party system, unlike, say, what's going on in Israel just at this point, where, well, you never see any party getting 50%, but then they form these coalitions. I mean, America is really built on a more centrist model, a little to the left, a little to the right. But as we keep going out to the extremes, what does that suggest?
Well, that has certainly been our tradition of kind of working more in the middle of the spectrum. But in recent years, the politics are becoming more polarized. There is more extremist rhetoric and more extremist policies from both sides of the political spectrum. You do have to wonder at some point, will there be an independent candidate who will be able to drive, right up the center and do well? For example, in the way that President Macron was able to do in France. He ran from outside the system and really didn't have strong ties to any of the major parties, but, ended up doing well. I think in the United States, it's harder to do that just because so much of our election process is centered around the two major parties. Michael Bloomberg, for example, the former mayor of New York City, thought about running as an independent, but concluded he couldn't win, that there were just too many ballot access problems, and it would just be hard to win if you were not a traditional Republican or Democrat.
We had on Mr. Zelizer from Princeton recently, and he wrote a book, Fault Lines, and it's along the lines of your concerns. And he said that the conservatives have taken control of the political narrative in America. And we see some of the loudest, most strident voices coming from the right. How important is that? Because we know that some feel that the browning of America, the demographic changes, are really, what's concerning a lot of people on the right, whether they say it openly or not. Their voices are getting louder by the day. They're feeling empowered by this presidency. And yet, is this a last gasp in terms of what their authority in the public square is going to be as the demographic shifts are taking place?
Well, that certainly is going to be an interesting question over the next 2 decades, because demographers do predict that by 2044, if you add up the number of African Americans, Latinos, and Asian Americans, they will constitute a majority of the country at that point. And I think some of the issues that we're debating now reflect the fact that some people see that demographic future and don't like it. And, obviously, most of those people ended up supporting Donald Trump. So that's going to be part of the political conflict that moves forward. It suggests that polarization isn't just a problem today, but could continue to be an issue in coming years. Social media fuel the extremism as well. Social media seems to be dividing people and encouraging polarization. So there are a lot of things pushing in that direction. And of course, we have to worry, at some point, is this going to ruin our political system and make it impossible for our democracy to function?
The base, everybody talks about the base that Donald Trump has, and yet some say that might be his last, resort and his last place he can go, because he hasn't seemed to have built upon that base, and that base might get him through one more election. But the Republicans in 2012, as I recall, after Romney lost to Barack Obama, said, we really need to expand the tent. So how perilous is that for the Republican Party going forward?
Well, in the long run, they face very difficult numbers just in terms of the demographic shifts that are taking place. But you're right that in 2016, Trump violated much of the advice in the Republican Party, which suggested Republicans needed to reach out at least to Latinos and Asian Americans and try and bring them into the fold. They needed to do a better job of enlisting the support of women across the country. Trump kind of threw that playbook completely out the window and basically said, hey, I'm going to play to the base, and then surprise everybody by winning and becoming president. So I think, Republicans can do that now, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in 2020. But it clearly is going to become more difficult to win on that kind of platform with each successive presidential election.
Well, Larry Sabato from the University of Virginia, who's quite an expert on where the winds are blowing in America, he said that you are an exception. You've lived in both red and blue worlds. You understand both. And throughout this book, you give very personal stories to enliven your narrative. So in closing today, Darrell, to put you on the spot, how can we bridge this seemingly wide gulf that we've got in America? Anything you want to offer? You see any signs, any hopes, any green shoots at this moment in time?
I try and close the book on a note of optimism by basically saying that to reduce the hyper conflict that we face right now, we have to address the root causes of polarization. And what that means is improving economic opportunity, dealing with the geographic disparities. Like, we can't have as big a divide as we have right now between the coast and the heartland. Like, that's just not a good formula for going forward. We have to figure out how to rejuvenate the American dream so that people don't feel like they're being left behind. We have to reduce the insider advantages and the fact that many people do believe that the system is rigged against them. At the personal level, I encourage people to diversify their information sources. Like, I try and read liberal, moderate, and conservative outlets. I watch Fox News from time to time. At the very end of the book, I have this radical idea, which I call take a liberal or a conservative to lunch. Meaning, if you're a liberal, find a conservative, take that individual to lunch, and listen, and just try and understand what their perspective is. Because one of the problems today is we see opponents as enemies, and we think that they are bad people, and people don't really socialize across party lines anymore. But we need to start doing that, because if we can humanize our opponents, it makes it easier to deal with people, to think about how to bargain and compromise and negotiate some of our differences and deal with some of these deep issues.
Well, the only problem that I have with an idea about taking the opposite to lunch is that that one's going to want to go for vegan food and the other to a steakhouse. So, there's trouble right there.
that could be a non-starter right there. You're right.
Darrell West, what a pleasure to have you back again on America Trends for your new book, Divided Politics, Divided Nation. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Larry.
America Trends podcast is part of the MHNR Network, mhnrnetwork.com.